They didn't ask him to leave. They just stopped looking at him. That's how it starts, in places like Caldwell Marsh Financial Group. Not with a shout, not with a memo. Just a slow, practiced invisibility, the kind that takes years to perfect and costs nothing to execute. A chair pulled away at the last second. An email chain that somehow skips one name. A conference room that's always already booked when you need it. Desmond Fulton had been watching it happen to other people for 22 years. He just never thought it would happen to him. Desmond was 53 years old, and he had spent the better part of 3 decades building something in this city that most people don't even attempt. He hadn't inherited a network. He hadn't gone to the right schools or married into the right family. He had walked into Caldwell Marsh at 31 with a finance degree from Howard University, a briefcase his mother had saved up 6 months to buy him, and the kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that people tend to mistake for arrogance. Right up until the moment they need something from you. He had made the firm real money. Not theoretical money, not projected money. Real, documented, quarterly report money. He'd built the Southeast regional portfolio from a mid-tier book of business into the firm's highest-performing division 3 years running. He had clients who called him before they called their own accountants. He had a reputation in this industry that his colleagues spent their nights trying to replicate and their days trying to ignore. And for a long time, that was enough. The work was enough. The results were enough. Then Craig Whitmore got promoted. Craig Whitmore was 41. He had a firm handshake, a golf handicap, and a habit of repeating other people's ideas in meetings as though he'd just invented them. He was the kind of man who used the word synergy without irony. He'd joined Caldwell Marsh 6 years ago, brought in from a mid-sized firm in Charlotte under the promise of fresh perspective, and in those 6 years he had produced 1 successful restructuring, 2 mediocre quarters, and a lot of very confident PowerPoint presentations. When the firm announced that Craig Whitmore would be stepping into the newly created role of Executive Vice President of Client Strategy, Desmond read the email 3 times. Then he called his wife. "They gave it to Craig," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia Fulton had been married to this man for 26 years. She knew that pause he was holding, the one where he was deciding whether to be angry or philosophical. She had watched him choose philosophical too many times. "What does that even mean? Client strategy," she said. "That's your entire job. That's literally what you've been doing." "They rebranded it," Desmond said. "Desmond, I know." He didn't file a complaint. Not then. He went back to work the next Monday, managed his portfolio, returned every call, met every deadline. He told himself it was one decision. He told himself the firm would recognize the mistake. He told himself a lot of things that late summer season that turned out not to be true. Because Craig Whitmore, newly minted EVP, immediately began dismantling everything Desmond had built. Not obviously. Not in a way you could point to in a single email. Whitmore was too practiced for that. He started by reassigning 2 of Desmond's junior analysts to his own team. For a special initiative, he said, which turned out to be a rebranding of Desmond's Southeast portfolio under a different name. Then he began attending client meetings that had nothing to do with his role, showing up with his blazer and his handshake and his ability to make Desmond feel, in front of the very clients Desmond had cultivated for years, like a supporting character in his own story. In October, during the Regional Director's Quarterly Review, Craig Whitmore stood up and presented numbers, Desmond's numbers. He called them the team's numbers. He did not say Desmond's name once. Afterward, in the hallway, a junior associate named Pell, 26, fresh out of Vanderbilt, clearly impressed, asked Whitmore a follow-up question about the Q3 Southeast returns. Whitmore said, without missing a beat, "That's been a firm-wide effort." A lot of people touched that. Pell nodded like this was wisdom. Desmond was standing 5 feet away. Neither of them looked at him. He started keeping records. Not because he'd planned to. It happened the way most important decisions happen, gradually, and then all at once. He'd started by simply forwarding his own emails to a personal account, just to have a copy. Then he started keeping a log. Dates, times, what was said, who was in the room, what was attributed to whom. He wasn't angry when he did it. He was methodical. There's a difference, and Desmond Fulton had spent a lifetime understanding that difference. Patricia saw him at the kitchen table, one Saturday morning, the legal pad out, the pen moving in his slow, deliberate handwriting. "How long have you been doing that?" she asked. "A while," he said. She sat down across from him and didn't say anything for a moment. She was a retired school principal. She had handled situations. She recognized the look of someone who was done waiting for a system to correct itself. "You need to call Adeze," she said. Adeze Okonkwo was an employment attorney. She was also their goddaughter, 20 years younger than Desmond, and the kind of woman who made opposing counsel want to reschedule their vacations. Desmond had watched her grow up. He remembered when she was afraid of lightning storms. He called her the next morning. She listened to everything. She did not interrupt. When he finished, there was the sound of her writing something down, and then she said, "Desmond, how long has this been going on?" 14 months, he said. Another pause. "And you have documentation for all of it?" "I have documentation for most of it," he said. "I have witnesses for the rest." The quiet on the line had a different quality then. Not surprise. Something more like sharpening. "Tell me about the witnesses," Adeze said. "The thing about being made invisible for 14 months is that other people see it happening even when they're afraid to say so out loud. There was a woman named Sylvette Caron, mid-40s, 15 years at the firm, senior relationship manager, who had watched Whitmore walk into Desmond's territory and seen enough to make her keep her own notes. She hadn't planned to use them. She'd told herself it wasn't her fight. But when Desmond called her, quietly, on a Thursday evening, she said, "I've been waiting for you to call." And her voice had the particular weight of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time. There was also a man named Obinna Tisei, a data analyst, technically a contractor, which meant he moved through the office like furniture and therefore heard everything. He had no particular loyalty to Desmond Fulton, but he had a very specific loyalty to accuracy, and what he had seen in the Q3 reporting cycle had offended something foundational in him. And there was Pell, the young associate, the one in the hallway. He came to Desmond on his own, knocked on Desmond's office door one Tuesday in November, which nobody did anymore. Desmond's office had become one of those places people walked past quickly, as though proximity to disfavor might be contagious. Pell sat down, smoothed his tie, and said, "I want you to know that was your work," he presented. He was nervous. His hands weren't entirely steady, but he sat there. Desmond looked at this 26-year-old kid and thought about himself at that age. The briefcase, the degree, the particular hope of a man who has not yet been shown where the ceilings are. "Thank you," Desmond said. "That took something." "I can put it in writing," Pell said. "If it would help." It would help. Adeze filed the complaint with the EEOC in January. The firm's first response was what Desmond had expected: polite confusion. A letter from their general counsel expressing that Caldwell and Marsh had a deep and long-standing commitment to equity in the workplace, and that the firm was unable to identify the patterns described in Mr. Fulton's claim. There was language in there about their DEI initiatives. There was a reference to their annual diversity report. It was a very well-written letter. Adeze read it, set it down, and said, "Good." Desmond looked at her. "Good? They're defending the system," she said. "Which means they haven't seen what we have yet. When they see what we have, they're going to want to talk." She was right, but not in the way anyone expected. Because what happened next was not a quiet negotiation. What happened next was a deposition. Desmond sat across a conference table from the firm's lead counsel, a man named Whitfield, not Craig Whitmore's Whitfield, a different one. A litigation Whitfield who had clearly been brought in for exactly this kind of situation. And Desmond answered every question with the patience of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for 14 months without knowing it. They asked about his performance reviews. He had them. All 22 years of them. They asked about the Southeast portfolio. He had the origination documents. He had the client correspondence. He had the internal memos, including 3 that bore Craig Whitmore's name but were composed almost entirely of language taken, verbatim and without attribution, from Desmond's own strategy reports. The litigation Whitfield's pen stopped moving at that point. He looked at the documents. He looked at Adeze. He looked at Desmond. "We'd like to take a brief recess," he said. Adeze said, "Of course." There are moments in a long fight when you can feel the ground shift beneath the other person's feet. Desmond had experienced enough of those moments in 22 years of finance to recognize the particular quality of the silence that followed that recess. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic, not numerical arithmetic, but the kind where you calculate what you can still afford to defend. The settlement negotiations began 3 weeks later. Desmond did not discuss the terms publicly, and he won't hear. What can be said is that Craig Whitmore was no longer EVP of Client Strategy by the end of February. What can also be said is that Caldwell and Marsh reached out, not through counsel, but directly through the firm's managing partner, a man named Chester Aldrich, who had known Desmond for 15 years and had somehow managed to not notice any of this, to ask if Desmond would consider staying. Chester Aldrich sat in the chair across Desmond's desk. The same desk, the same office that had been slowly emptied of its significance over 14 months, and said, "We want to make this right." Desmond looked at him for a long moment. "Chester," he said, "I've been making this right for 22 years. He gave the firm his notice the following Monday. He had 3 clients call him before noon asking where he was going and whether they could follow him there. By Wednesday, he had calls from 5 more. By the end of the month, Desmond Fulton had signed a lease on office space downtown. Nothing fancy. 7th floor, corner unit, view of the river. Enough room for a receptionist, 2 junior analysts, and the kind of quiet that lets you think. He named the firm Fulton Capital Advisors. Patricia had said, "That's it? Just your name?" "That's it," he said. "You're not going to do something dramatic like Phoenix or Ascend or my name's been on their work for 22 years without credit," Desmond said. "I think it's time it was on something with my name on it." She didn't argue with that. The first call he made from the new office was to Sylvette Caron. He offered her a position. She accepted before he finished the sentence. The second call was to Obina Tissé. Obina said he'd been thinking about leaving consulting anyway. He'd wanted stability. He wanted to work somewhere where the numbers meant what they said they meant. "That's the whole premise here," Desmond said. Obina started the following Monday. He did not call Pell because Pell was 26 and had a future at a firm that was now quietly working very hard to demonstrate its commitment to equity in the workplace. Desmond had seen enough to know that the young man would be fine. Some of the obstacles had been moved. There were 7 clients in the first 3 months, 14 by the 6th month. By the end of the first year, Fulton Capital Advisors had 31 clients, a 3rd analyst, and a wait list. Chester Aldrich called once in the fall on a personal number. He said the firm missed Desmond's expertise. He said things had changed. He used the word culture 3 times in 2 minutes, which Desmond understood to be a form of therapy that didn't require a therapist. Desmond was polite. He always was. He said he was happy where he was. He wished Chester well. He meant it in the way that a man means something when he has closed a door carefully and has no intention of reopening it. When he hung up, he looked out the window at the river. 22 years of somebody else's watermark on his work. 22 years of being the answer to a question they kept pretending they hadn't asked. 22 years of performing excellence in a room that had agreed, quietly, collectively, to misread it as ordinary. He'd kept records. He'd called a daisy. He'd sat in that deposition room and answered every question and not once raised his voice, not because he wasn't angry. He was at times very angry, but because he had understood, somewhere along the way, that composure is not the opposite of power. Sometimes composure is the weapon. He thought about Sylvette in the office down the hall, and Obina running numbers that were finally going to be attributed to the people who ran them, and the 31 clients who had chosen this place with his name on the door. He thought about his mother's briefcase. The quietest person in the room, he thought, is often the one who already knows how the story ends. He had known for a while.